The Whigs had lost their standard bearer, and America was moving on without them. As it moves on to the Pacific, the eyes of Texas, and then the case of Amistad, and then the halls of Montezuma. There you see a photograph taken from a wagon train, and you can see what life was like on the wagon circuit. It was not an easy life at all. It was very tough and very difficult. Oftentimes the people were leaving to escape depression and debt, which meant that they were already poor. Because of the Depression, America was on the move yet again. From 1836 until 1848, the United States will expand all the way to the Pacific under the guise of manifest destiny. What is attracting these people to go west? Well, we've already talked about the debt that they're trying to escape, but there is also opportunity out in the west, the extractive industries of fur, logging, gold, and silver. The great migrations begin as they always begin, with the missionaries, going out to preach to the savage tribes, the quote-unquote uncivilized tribes, the unchristianized tribes. They are soon followed by other groups along the Mormon Trail, the Oregon Trail, and so forth. The Mormons, they move west from Nauvoo, Illinois, after Joseph Smith was murdered in jail and during a political fight. And so the Mormons decided that they had had enough, and they moved west along the Mormon Trail to Salt Lake City, where they established their various communities. And a large portion of the population of the country was moving toward Texas, led by those such as Stephen F. Austin. Many of the Texans that came, or people that came to Texas, were empresarios. That was, they were given large tracts of land, as in plantations, to develop in East Texas by the Mexican government, because the Mexican government needed their wealth to undergird the economy and needed them to develop it. But this causes very quickly a sharp division between the two groups of people that live in Texas. One group is the Tejanos. They are the Mexican-born, Catholic inhabitants. They tended not to own slaves because the Catholic Church tended to go against slavery. And you had the Texicans. These are the American immigrants. They're mostly Protestant, and they are slave owners. This is Austin's people. Here you see the Oregon Trail that began in Independence, Missouri, and ended up in Oregon City, Oregon, and the Mormon Trail that went from Nauvoo, Illinois, all the way to the Great Salt Lake and the Great Basin of Utah. The photograph that you see here is of a young Brigham Young, leader of the Mormon community after Joseph Smith was killed in prison. And the picture later shows a older Brigham Young, after whom the university was established, and whose sixth great-grandson is the former quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, Steve Young. In Texas, finally, the American inhabitants clashed enough with the Mexican authorities that led to the Texas Rebellion of 1836. What was behind all this was Mexican corruption and inefficiency, combined with the Texicans' desire to enter the United States. The Protestant slave-owning overlords were taking on the Catholic overlords, and so the Protestant Americans, the Texicans in Texas, formed what was known as the Committee of Consultation. This, of course, means that the Texans are in rebellion, and the Mexicans send their president and general, Antonio Lopez de Santana, one of the most interesting figures of Mexican history. He will be in and out of politics for the next 50 years, as a matter of fact. And it is, of course, along the San Antonio River at a little mission called the Alamo that one of the great and most futile stands ever takes place. This, of course, is where Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie of Opelousas, Louisiana, William Travis, a 26-year-old Texas militia captain who had abandoned his pregnant wife and child back in the United States to go to Texas and escape debt. Here, 5,000 Mexicans took on 187 rebels and eventually overwhelmed them. However, the Alamo served to inspire the rest of the Texicans to rise up, and under the leadership of Sam Houston, the Texicans won their independence from Mexico. At the Battle of San Jacinto, Santana was captured and was forced to sign the Treaty of Velasco. Now, the Mexican government did not officially recognize the Treaty of Velasco, for they said that Santana had been removed as president prior to him signing the treaty. The Texicans, on their part, said, "We don't care who signed the treaty, we are independent now." And so the Mexicans allowed Texas a certain amount of autonomy without trying to interfere with them, but they claimed Texas as part of their country. That's very important. Keep that in mind. Here you see a map showing what was claimed by the Republic of Texas, the Lone Star Republic, in the purple, and the green was the disputed area. You see there the locations of the Battle of San Jacinto and the Battle of the Alamo. This is an artist's depiction of the Battle of San Jacinto. This is the San Jacinto Monument in the usual Texas style. It is rather large. You can actually see this monument from the interstate as you are heading west on I-10 toward Houston from Lake Charles. Clockwise from the top left is Antonio Lopez de Santana. Top center is Stephen F. Austin. At the top right is a very old Sam Houston when he was a U.S. Senator from Texas. Bottom right, William Travis. Bottom center, Jim Bowie. And the bottom left, David Crockett, who was a friend of Andrew Jackson and also knew Daniel Boone, a protege of Daniel Boone. In 1839, a Spanish ship carrying a cargo of slaves was actually taken over by the African slaves. They killed most of the crew, but forced two of the men to sail them back to Africa. The two Spaniards, knowing full well that the slaves had no understanding of the sea and navigation, sailed them instead to the coast of the United States, where the U.S. Navy took them into custody in the state of Connecticut, a free state. The Spanish government claimed the Africans. The two commanders of the two Spaniards on the ship claimed them as a prize of war. The slave factors in the United States certainly warranted these Africans to continue as slaves, as chattel, but the abolitionists also wanted them to be freed. And the abolitionists take up the case of the Africans, led by Roger Sherman Baldwin. The U.S. District Court in New Haven ruled in favor of the Africans and called it unlawful kidnapping, and the case then went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court affirmed the unlawful kidnapping on March the 9th, 1841, and sent the slaves back home to Africa as free. What's interesting about this case, which is a great story in and of itself, is that the chief counsel for the slaves, next to Roger Sherman Baldwin, was John Quincy Adams, the former president. John Quincy Adams had left the presidency in 1829, having served only one term. He went home to Massachusetts, and there the people of Massachusetts demanded that he represent their district. And so he was elected to the House of Representatives, where he would then sit for the next 20 years almost. For the next 16 years, serving his congressional district. He's one of the few presidents that has served in a public office after his presidency. He was getting old. He was considered to be doddering, but he makes a pretty effective argument in front of the Supreme Court. In 1844, the Whigs, who had been deprived of William Henry Harrison, their great leader in 1840, now adopt a plank against expanding the nation because they are generally against spreading slavery into more territory. They choose Henry Clay as their standard bearer. The Democrats, they are on a pro-expansion platform, and they choose James Knox Polk of Tennessee, a protege of Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Jackson's still alive, and helping Polk along the way helps elect the Democratic ticket. And so James K. Polk becomes the President of the United States. But James K. Polk does something very interesting. He says that he's only going to serve one term as president, and he may have been a prophet of his own fate because he died only a few months after leaving office in 1849. Well, James K. Polk has two major issues that he's dealing with as the nation expands. One is Oregon in the upper Northwest. Both the United States and Britain claimed the Oregon Territory. The United States adopted a war cry almost of 5440 or fight, which was the northern boundary of British Columbia, Canada today. That's 54 degrees 40 minutes north latitude. Well, rather than go to war against the British, which they did not want to really do, they instead compromised using the Convention of 1818 as their template, and they chose the 49th parallel instead, which is again showing you how the United States got its northern border. Besides, the United States did not want to go to war against another white nation. They would much have preferred to go to war against Mexico, because Mexico was the Catholic, darker power, and it stood in the way of the U.S.'s main drive for the Pacific. And so they started with Texas. Texas had wanted to come into the Union for some time. It was called itself a republic, and it had a nation. Sam Houston was the president, but they were in long negotiations to come into the country. Well, finally, via a treaty in 1845, Texas is brought into the Union with the help of President John Tyler and John C. Calhoun. Well, Mexico, remember, had always claimed Texas as its own property. And when Texas does this, and the United States accepts Texas into the Union and raises the American flag over Texas, Mexico severs diplomatic relations with Washington and sends home the American ambassador. They throw him out, and his name is John P. Slidell. This map shows now the Texas annexation. I'd shown this map earlier, but now you can focus on the Texas annexation of 1845. Tragically enough, during the debate over the admission of Texas, Representative John Quincy Adams, the son of the former president and former president himself, in giving a speech on the floor of the House, collapsed and died. This led to war with Mexico. The war with Mexico was a border dispute. Was it the Rio Grande River, or was it the Nueces River further to the north, as Mexico was grudgingly giving in to the U.S. claim on Texas? But the Nueces River issue was the last straw for Mexico, and so they declared war and then attacked the U.S. at Matamoros. Congress declared war, but it was not a unanimous declaration. Stephen Wilmot of Pennsylvania offered the Wilmot Proviso, which said that we can go to war, but it is absolutely imperative that we do not spread slavery to any territory that has been captured from Mexico in northeastern Mexico. The Wilmot Proviso
This is where Zachary
was voted
Taylor
down.
became a national hero.
Soon after, during the debate, a young 37-year-old congressman from
Santana
Illinois
to
by
the
the name
north
of Abraham Lincoln stood
to
up
fight Taylor,
and demanded
which left
that there
Mexico
be a
City
resolution taken
undefended.
to
And so
name the
Winfield
exact
Scott
spot
goes
on which
into
hostilities
Mexico City
between
and
the
is
U.S.
essentially
and Mexico commenced,
marching around
and whether or not
Mexico
it
City
took
with no
place in the
government
United States
to
or in Mexico.
for him to
That resolution
mandate
was
a
also
surrender.
voted down. But
In
now
the
Abraham
process,
Lincoln
his
had
men
joined
stormed
the
the
political discussion.
castle of Chapultepec,
So the
which
U.S.
was used
goes
as
to
a
war with
military
Mexico.
academy at the time. and
Immediately, they
slaughtered
start
all the
sending
young
army
military
units toward the border of
cadets
Texas,
in there.
and also into
Eventually,
what is later the American
Mexican
Southwest,
government
to
would sign
take
what was
over
known
that
as the Treaty
area
of Guadalupe
the world.
Hidalgo of
Stephen
1848.
Kearny is the
This
general
was
who takes over
negotiated
the
by John
Southwest.
P. Slidell
John C.
and
Fremont
Nicholas
is
Trist,
sent to California.
Nicholas Trist of St. Bernard
Zachary
Parish.
Taylor, nicknamed
In the
Old
treaty,
Rough
the
and
United
Ready for his
States
appearance
takes
and his
all
gruff
of
exterior,
California
was sent to
and the
northern
American Southwest.
Mexico, as we know it today. And
In
Winfield
return,
Scott,
the United States
nicknamed
pays
Old Fuss
Mexico
and Feathers
$15
because he
million
was always
for the
impeccably
territory.
dressed and
It
carried
secures the
himself with a great
damages
deal
to
of
Texans.
charm and charisma. He was
And the
sent
Senate
to
ratifies
Veracruz,
the treaty in
the same route
1848.
that Cortez
James
would
K.
use to
Polk was
go
not happy
up
with this.
to
He was not
Mexico
happy with
City.
Slidell and Trist because he wanted all of
Mexicans,
Mexico.
They had
However,
Santana.
Many
again,
of those in
as their
Congress would
general.
not have taken all of Mexico because the southern part of Mexico, which we call the country of Mexico today, was far more inhabited than the area that the U.S. was going to take in Guadalupe Hidalgo. And it had far more darker skin, Catholic inhabitants down there. So race and religion again play a very key role in the signing of the treaty and the taking of the Southwest. The legacy of the war is very simple. This is naked aggression on the part of the U.S. They had territory, we wanted it, we took it by force. And it makes Mexican inhabitants outlaws in American territory. They did not cross the border crossed them. And now you have huge tracts of land under debate regarding whether or not they'll become slave or free. And perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Mexican War is that this was the training ground for future Civil War soldiers. Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, George McClellan, George Pickett, James Longstreet, are but many of those who are young soldiers at the time of the Mexican War and will then turn and make their bones in the Civil War. You can also add to the roles people like Jefferson Davis was a soldier in this war. Franklin Pierce was a soldier in this war. So this is the real legacy of the Mexican War, often forgotten, but it is a very important war to remember because it's the prelude to the Civil War. The major generals of the Mexican War on the left, Old Fuss and Feathers, Winfield Scott. In the center, the very rough-looking Zachary Taylor, Old Rough and Ready. And on the right, the hard-drinking Pathfinder, as he was known, John C. Fremont. This is the text of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in both Spanish and in English. And here you see the large tract of territory taken by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the whole states of California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, some of Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming. You see down the tanned area, the Gadsden Purchase. That would be added later in 1854 to the United States. And the man that made that purchase possible was none other than Jefferson Davis. And that territory was added for the purposes of building a southern transcontinental railroad. Here are two young soldiers of the Mexican War. On the left is 37-year-old Lieutenant Robert E. Lee, who was an engineer assigned to Zachary Taylor. He actually surveyed the battlefield at Buena Vista. On the right is a 24-year-old cavalry officer by the name of Ulysses S. Grant, who was very clean-shaven in that picture. Grant was ordered to stay back with the horses, but he disobeyed orders and decided to ride into the battle, where, when you disobey orders, you're either court-martialed or given a medal. He was given a medal for his bravery and heroism. Both Lee and Grant met on the battlefield at Buena Vista, and they exchanged pleasantries, saluted, and shook hands with each other. They would not meet each other again in person for 17 years, 1865.